Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Javiera Barandiarán as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Javiera is an associate professor in the Global Studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She earned her PhD in environmental science, policy and management from the University of California, Berkeley, where she also completed a master's in public policy. Originally from Chile, she began her academic journey with a BA in politics from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Professor Javiera's research examines how science, environmental policy, and development intersect across Latin America, particularly as societies respond to the global demand for natural resources such as lithium. Her scholarship has been recognized with prestigious honors, including a Bellagio residency from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Berlin Prize from the American Academy. Her work has also received support from the National Science Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and Chile's National Agency for Science, among others. In today's conversation, Dr. Javiera discusses key ideas from her book, Living Minerals, Nature, Trade, and Power in the Race of Lithium. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Javiera Barandiarán to the conversation. Dr. Javiera, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you, Deepak. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your book opens in Silver Bay and the Atacama Salt Flat, tracing a long arc of lithium extraction across Nevada and Chile. What first drew you personally into the story? And when did you realize lithium could serve as a lens on global power and climate politics rather than just a niche mineral market?
Yes, so thank you. As you mentioned in the introduction, very kind introduction, I was born in Chile. So my family lives in Chile, and my family is actually originally from Argentina. So I have a deep connection to this part of the world. I've been working and doing research in Chile for many, many years. And it was during one of these trips in 2010 when I first began to hear about lithium mining in Chile. So Chile, for those who don't know, has been a major mining country really since its founding. From the 1870s onward, it was a major source of natural nitrates. This industry sort of peaked in the 1920s and 1930s. Natural nitrates are used as fertilizers, but also as explosives, so they were very important to global trade. And then after that, it has been a major source of copper, probably the world's single most important source of copper. Copper, of course, is used in the electric grid, in all electronics, and it continues to be the best conductor of electricity that we have available to us. So Chile has this incredible mining history. It's a mining country. Minerals have been sort of the national wage, as it's been called at different times. Me and most Chileans had never heard of lithium. And it was a surprise to learn that lithium was also an important mineral produced by Chile. So in 2010, when I was visiting, I was surprised to first hear about it because I heard that engineering students at the National University of Chile in downtown Santiago, so these are the nation's best students, many of whom will go on to work in the mining industry. They were holding a workshop and a series of protests, really, calling for the nationalization of lithium. So this was kind of real news to me. When I get back home, at the time I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area and near Silicon Valley in California, there I'm hanging out socially with people who work in Google and Silicon Valley, and I hear them talking about lithium and electric vehicles, batteries, laptops, the use of all these portable batteries. And tying the two things together, I thought this is going to be interesting and important as time goes on. And then I found this New Yorker piece that I talk about in the book. So in 2010, the New Yorker magazine, which is a very important magazine here in the United States that tends to write about a series of really important public issues, from a progressive perspective or somewhat progressive perspective, has this article, a beautiful article with beautiful photos, asking whether Bolivia could become the Saudi Arabia of the electric car era. So Bolivia, like Chile and Argentina, has major deposits of lithium. And that's when I learned that the Bolivian government had just launched a new industrialization with sovereignty strategy. So what this means was a strategy to develop lithium mining, but not just to produce lithium, but to also produce all the downstream products, so batteries, cars. So in order to use the mining industry to actually industrialize the country rather than repeat the same old pattern that is so common in many developing countries of just being locked into the export of relatively low value raw materials. So those three things together all came together in this short period of time. So in a way, from the get-go, it became clear to me that this was a story about global power and climate change, and not just a story about climate change and sort of looking towards climate futures.
Professor, you describe lithium as having ontological fluidity, slipping between categories like mineral, salt, strategic resource, and ecosystem element. How does this conceptual slipperiness shape the way states, companies, and communities fight over lithium? And what does it hide from public debate?
Yeah, so as this introduction might give you a sense for, from the get-go, lithium has been animating these very optimistic scenarios of industrialization, that lithium is going to break with past forms of development. So that's one example of its ontological fluidity. So what I mean by this is that lithium isn't this singular thing. We talk about lithium in the singular, but really it's multiple different things all at once, and it fluctuates between them. This isn't a necessarily good or a bad thing. I see this as just a trait of that lithium has, and then different groups can use that fluidity to advance their goals. So lithium, for example, doesn't exist in nature as such. It's always bound to something else. Another way in which we see this ontological fluidity is that in both Chile and the United States, as I found through my research, lithium has sometimes been regulated as a hard rock mineral, and sometimes it has been regulated as a liquid or as a salt deposit, as part of these saline deposits, they're called. And so in both countries, sometimes these regulations have existed in contradiction to each other at the same time. And other times we see, and this is one of the things I analyze, the ways in which certain groups really excelled at the work of moving lithium around these categories to advance their goals. And I look at the Foot Mineral Company, which was one of two companies that produced lithium between World War II and the 1990s. And they really excelled at this kind of pushing the ontological fluidity of lithium in specific ways to advance their own goals and their own interests. Another really specific example is these ongoing struggles to define and to try to answer what is a very political question. Would there be enough lithium, right? This sounds like an empirical question, like we should be able to count how much lithium there is underground, but it actually turns out to be extremely difficult to do that. And so there was intense disagreements over the best scientific methods, technological tools, models, and approaches for how to estimate how much lithium there actually was. In the book, I argue that this question is actually a very political question because it has a lot to do with how different groups, so government geologists, industry geologists, nuclear scientists, the kinds of futures and energy technologies that they were each seeking to promote at different times. And so because lithium has this ontological fluidity where it exists in different deposits, it comes in clays, rocks, brines, it is particularly hard to count and map. And so it lends itself really well to these kinds of struggles, really. All of which then on top of it lithium is used in these very sort of charged energy technologies. It was used in nuclear fusion technology, which is also used for the mechanism in the thermonuclear bombs. These are still the most powerful and destructive bombs that humans have ever made. And of course, in electric vehicles and batteries, which have been around for decades and which in the 1960s were also sort of seen as the next phase and the solution to many of the problems that oil-based cars, oil-run cars were posing. And so in a way, lithium has always had a more important future than its present. And that has been very important in opening the door to these sort of very symbolic charge that lithium has. That's part of why we talk about lithium dreams, but not nickel dreams or cobalt dreams, as we don't hear that for other minerals. And so all of that I attribute in the end to lithium's sort of particular ontological fluidity.
Professor, a recurring argument you make is that debates framed around resource nationalism often reduce real ecological limits to a narrow question of market scarcity. How has this resource nationalist lens shaped Chile's and United States lithium policies? And what alternative framing would you like policymakers to adopt?
Right. So I argue in the book that we really need to shift away from the critical minerals, strategic minerals. I try to not even use the terms in the book and when I talk about minerals, because we need to see all of these as what they really are, which is elements of nature that we should be using with care and with responsibility. So when we look at the past or the past century of mineral politics and mineral trading between the United States and Chile, what I argue is that this resource nationalist perspective, first, it was very strong in both countries. So the United States is also a resource nationalist country. That has become a much easier argument to make under the current administration and many of the policies that are being pursued at this moment in the United States. But it has also, that's what US policy has been like historically. So in the 1950s, for example, US minerals policy used tools like trade blocks, stockpiling, cartels, and this protected duopoly between the Foot Mineral Company and the Lithium Corporation of America to try to control the lithium trade. This was part of a broader moment in which, during the Korean War, where the U.S. was active in sort of in the Korean Peninsula, where the U.S. government sort of redefined national security to include access to cheap consumer goods. And in order to deliver cheap consumer goods, which is what the government needed to do in order to preserve its legitimacy as the representative of the nation, they needed to secure cheap minerals in order, to deliver that for middle-class consumers in the U.S. And so I trace in the book the ways in which copper was taken on and off this list of critical minerals at the time, always in reaction to Chilean policy. So at the time, Chilean policy was trying to get a higher price for copper because essentially, as the Chileans would say, there were at least three different markets for copper. There was the communist market, there was the European market that was based on the London's minerals market exchange rate, and then there was the US market, which was the largest one, right? Chile and the US have always been major trading partners. And so that's just an example of the ways in which resource nationalism is a policy, is a package of policies to block and slow trade in ways that are motivated by rivalries, by fears of loss of control in the case of the United States, and by fears in the case of Chile that the country isn't benefiting as it should from its mineral resources. If we continue like that, we're going to end up in the exact same place, which is, markets driving a constant demand for minerals. So we need to really break away from this kind of framework. And so what I argue instead is that we need to see living minerals, and this means asking different questions when it comes to thinking about minerals. So the question isn't, is there enough lithium? Because the answer to that is that there will never be enough, right? Markets and politics will work together to always try to secure more lithium because there will never be enough. There will never be a moment of satiated markets. It doesn't work that way. And I trace in the book the ways why that doesn't work that way. And so instead, we need to be asking ourselves what forms of life will survive this pace and scale of extraction.
Professor, you use the notion of mining memories to describe how societies remember past booms in nitrates, copper, and other minerals, and then project those memories onto lithium. Could you unpack this idea and share a concrete example of how mining memories influence today's decisions in Chile or the wider Southern Cone?
Sure. So there's really a lot of nostalgia around minerals, which is something that I've always been fascinated by. There's this really entrenched common sense that if you have as a nation, as a territory, mineral wealth, that should deliver wealth, well-being, progress, wealth, monetary wealth. And that has actually rarely been the case, right? The history of mining and well-being and development is very, very complicated and usually not very positively correlated. And so I've always been fascinated by this nostalgia. And what I think the concept of mining memories helps to do is to both recognize and, in a way, honor those aspirations for well-being that different communities, workers, and many others have pinned on minerals, but at the same time, recognize that the reality in the past has always been more complicated, and that certainly going forward, we need to be thinking about minerals differently. It seems increasingly unlikely in an exhausted planet of widespread ecological destruction, where the fence line communities near mines are losing access to water, are losing access to their lands, and are having to live with very large toxic piles of waste. It seems increasingly unlikely that minerals are going to deliver that kind of well-being. So to give you an example, in Chile, it's really common, even the current president, Gabriel Boric, when he announced a national lithium strategy a few years ago, he said lithium won't be like copper and nitrate. So again, the two major mineral commodities that Chile has produced over the last century and a half. And I find that a fascinating statement because the legacies of copper and nitrate are incredibly complex, right? Both of these have been the national wage. It is thanks to both of them that Chile has, a national school system, its first civil service, emblematic buildings like the National Library, and so much more. And they've shaped our laws and our policies, the first tax regime, have created, generations of experts, of professionals, a labor movement, etc. But what it speaks to is this really deep sense of frustrated development, right? Because the implication is that Chile needs to do better when it comes to lithium than it has in the past with copper and nitrate. And so trying to figure out exactly what folks are mobilizing when they make those kinds of statements, what kinds of memories they are projecting onto these minerals was one of the questions that motivated the book.
Professor, one of the striking through lines in the book is exhaustion of brines of ecosystems like salt flats and saline lakes, and of communities living next to mines. How did your fieldwork in places like Salar de Atacama reshape your understanding of what exhaustion means in mineral fund trials?
Yeah, so the exhaustion was a really key part and was a starting point because in the Atacama Desert, where the largest and the cheapest single mine of lithium and of brine lithium exists and has been operating there since the 1980s, early 1980s. This is the world's driest desert. We have known for over a century that this is the world's driest desert. Within close proximity of the lithium mines, several of the world's largest copper mines also exist. And in the last 10 years, new lithium and copper mines are being added to this region. So it's just an incredible, in many ways, it's an incredible gift of nature that this incredibly dry desert has been able to provide the world with so many minerals for 150 years. But even, of course, even here, this is an exhausted ecosystem. So the term exhausted originally came from a government agency that regulates water for all industrial uses in Chile, and they officially declared a basin in this region as officially exhausted. I use it in a much broader way to think about the ways in which ecosystems as a whole are becoming exhausted. I think in general, as a society, as a global society, we struggle to remember the cumulative environmental harms. You know, we're constantly talking about environmental damage in a way that sort of setting new baselines and looking forward, therefore erasing that accumulation of harms. Even the way people talk about the Atacama as if this was a peripheral and remote region, and they talk about lithium without often recognizing all the copper mining happening right there. So in all our daily speaking, we tend to erase all that exhaustion. We're also exhausted in terms of policy ideas. And so to go back to the idea of living minerals, part of what I argue is that we need to think of lithium and copper and any mineral as it is extracted from the ground and it runs out because all of these minerals are non-renewable on human timescales. That's a process of extinction. So just as the minerals become extinct in the lands, so do emblematic, well, plant and animal species, some of them emblematic, like the flamingo on the cover of the book, that rely on the ecosystems where these minerals also exist. And so we need to think of these as processes of extinction. And just a few days ago, the Intergovernmental Panel for for biodiversity and ecosystem services, their report makes this exact same argument that if companies are not paying attention to the extinction crisis, the extinction of life, then their own businesses, their own companies are also going to go extinct. And in a way, that's very much the argument I make in the book in my use of the idea of exhaustion.
Professor, electric vehicles are often sold as symbol of a green revolution. Yet, you show how large mineral-intensive EVs can reproduce many of the same extractive and unequal patterns as the fossil fuel era. If you were advising transport planners or manufacturers, what would be a genuinely low extraction mobility transition look like in practice?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if this was my missed calling in life to work more thinking about public transit and urban mobility in particular. And I'm very proud that my niece is actually following in that line of work. So, what would a genuinely low extraction mobility transition look like in practice? It certainly does not look like what we are developing right now. When we look at what electric vehicle models on the market look like, these cars are just getting larger and larger. In the United States, I think it's over 60% of the models on the market, might even be 80%, are large SUV, so these so-called sport utility vehicles. But it's not just in the United States, also in Europe and in China. It's a very large number of large models. The average car, which is smaller than most of these models that are on the market, already uses 4 times more metals than the average diesel or gas-powered car. So we're talking about a lot of minerals. This has consequences for equity because a lot of working class families, certainly in this country and here in California where I am, but I think globally, can no longer afford a car. So the idea of the affordable car seems to be increasingly an idea of the past. And car manufacturers are pushing on consumers these large, expensive vehicles because that's where they make money. That's where the biggest profit margins are. So what we're working towards, what we have, is very far away from a low extraction mobility transition. So what would that look like? Certainly public transit, and of course here the United States has a lot to learn from other countries, including countries and cities far poorer than the cities here in the United States. And again, here in California, cities far poorer than Los Angeles or San Francisco or Santa Barbara, where I live, that have figured this out, that have figured out how to provide much better quality public transportation for the mass of its citizens. Holistic urban planning, so thinking about how to do densification in a smart way, in a livable way, so creating, livable neighborhoods. And I think urban planners talk about sort of the 15-minute neighborhoods where, so zones where within 15 minutes you have residences and you have basic commercial services, so that people don't have to be leaving their neighborhood every time they want to go to a park or buy, some milk and basic groceries. I want to say it shouldn't necessarily be a one size fits all. And so cities and countryside, farming areas, cold areas, hot areas, they might not all require the same kind of mobility and transportation options. What might make sense for one place might not be what's required somewhere else. And this is important because there's been a lot of tension manufactured between urban and rural areas, because it's I can totally see how in certain rural areas an electric vehicle is unusable. And I think we also need to think about luxury emissions. So there might be some forms of transportation that should simply be banned. Private jets, right? The use of private jets has increased dramatically. I've heard reports, for example, in Los Angeles following the wildfires of a year ago, that certain wealthy people have moved to Arizona and fly in to LA on essentially private taxis on a weekly basis or even on a daily basis. Those kinds of things should simply be banned, right? If we think that we each have a carbon budget, and then the wealthiest members of society are the ones who are clearly surpassing that individual carbon budget and whose habits would have to change the most in order to bring them into line with, a low extraction, low carbon mobility world.
Professor, your archival work reveals the long and sometimes surprising entanglements between Chilean agencies like Corfo, companies such as Fute Mineral and SQM, and US strategic interest. What did you find most revealing or unsettling in those archives about how lithium markets were actually constructed?
Yeah, so the book, the bulk of the book is really based on archival documents, as you've mentioned. And I was really lucky to find a really rich archive in Chile. And this archive was maintained by Corfo, which is a state agency that was created back in 1939 to help develop and direct Chilean investments in national development, so to foster national development. And one of the arguments I make is that Corfo, then this agency, played a really crucial role in designing and both developing the expertise needed to mine lithium in the Atacama salt flat and in informing the legal framework that enabled this joint venture essentially between the US, the Chilean state and the US company Foot Mineral to function. And this framework, despite all the debates that we've had, beginning with those engineering students in 2010, despite all these repeated efforts to try to redefine the role of the state and where exactly private and public initiatives should start and stop, that framework that Gorfo helped to author has remained intact and has actually been validated again and again through the political process in Chile. So it's important to understand how it came to be and how we got here, because it's interesting to sort of how resistant to change it has been. Now, one of the things that really surprised me was how little those geopolitical debates, that question, would there be enough lithium for a nuclear fusion future or for an electric vehicle future? How little that question actually shaped on the ground industrial practices. So, on the ground, the design of the mines and the actual act of mining was very wasteful. A lot of lithium was and is wasted. A lot of brine is wasted. It's lost to leakage and all kinds of other things, over pumping, pumping in the wrong places. So that was really interesting that there was this big jump between those two things, as if they were really operating on different planets, even though it was often the very same people involved in both actions. The other thing that I look at that I found surprising was that the US team and the Chilean team, they worked really well together. They got along really well. I was able to interview also many of these people, many of these individuals. They have very fond memories of each other. And yet, when I look at it over time, you see the ways in which scientific colonialism gets reproduced. And so there's this unspoken hierarchy that really, when you look at it over time, adds up to big effects where the Chileans have a consistently difficult time knowing as much about their territory as the US Americans. And so that's what I mean by scientific colonialism, and I trace it over the 20th century and how it's reproduced. Again, even when people really got along so well on the ground and really have a lot of affection and respect for each other. And then the final thing that was really surprising was just how little questions about water featured in their work and in their tests and in their models and in their concerns. Because again, this is the world's most dry, most arid desert, and there's no mention in the archive of where was the drinking water for all these workers and for these US Americans coming from, and no concern about long-term water exhaustion in this region. And I just found that surprising, given that they describe it as a water operation, right? They describe it as a lake of lithium, and they describe it as a form of water mining, essentially.
Professor, rights of nature frameworks appear in your conclusion as one pathway to reimagining minerals as part of living ecosystems rather than an isolated commodities. What would it mean in concrete legal or policy terms to treat salt flats and brines as right-bearing entities in the context of lithium extraction?
Yeah, so rights of nature laws now exist in over 30 countries, right? In India, the Ganges has rights of nature through a Supreme Court decision. There's lots of really interesting scholarship that compares the different ways in which countries have adopted rights of nature laws. Usually, these tend to be at the subnational level, so only Ecuador so far has rights of nature in its constitution. And as the case of India perhaps helps to illustrate, often these are very legal regimes, right? They're based on litigation, on the judicial court system. And its rights of nature sort of translated into three very concrete rights: the right to exist, which, as I mentioned before, we are living in times of an extinction crisis. So that right to exist is really not something that we should take for granted, because a lot of plant and animal life is facing an extinction crisis. The right to regenerate and the right to flourish. And what's also important about those two rights is that they exist, it's sort of regenerate and flourish on its own terms. So not through, human engineered systems. I'm using rights of nature in a far more conceptual way because part of what I think we need to do at this point is, in many ways, we're beginning to see the effectiveness and the success of rights of nature as a legal doctrine in litigation and in the courts. And so now we need to make this more of a political movement. We need to integrate it more broadly into our cultures, and particularly our Western consumer cultures, because many indigenous cultures around the world, they hear about this, and I've been in those meetings with them where they hear about rights of nature and it resonates very naturally for them. This is how many indigenous communities already think and operate. And so in that sense, we Westerners have to learn from them a lot more. Um, and so the two kind of concrete next steps that I think the book is trying to help us advance towards. First, when we think of rights of nature in the courts, the literature is increasingly asking itself, well, if, flamingos or salt flats have legal standing, who will speak for them in court? And a lot of the lawyers and legal scholars that are writing this literature are turning to scientists as sort of these privileged spokespersons of nature. Well, in the book, I talk about the legacies of scientific colonialism. I also analyze in a lot of detail the ecological, what I call ecological fiction. So the systematic misrepresentations of nature that the geologists and the mining engineers sort of created and sustained over time in order to design the mines in specific ways, to say that it would actually be a grave mistake to leave this speaking for nature only in the hands of scientists. This should be a much more democratic and holistic thing where local communities, indigenous communities, ancestral knowledge, industrial practices as well, mining memory. So these very political and emotional memories that we have of the past, all of these things need to be informing how nature might come to speak for itself in courts of law. So that's one concrete thing that I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to. And then how to translate this into broader policy, how to translate rights of nature into policies like the environmental impact assessment process, which, for better and for worse, is still the most commonly used environmental policy around the world. Now, nearly every country uses environmental impact assessments in one way or another. And I think there's a lot to be done in redefining the kinds of questions that environmental impact assessments ask. So these EIAs, they usually try to take baseline conditions. So what is the environment like right now before this project comes in, and then anticipate future impacts. First, those baselines are doing a poor job of taking into account the accumulation of harms that already exist. They're also doing a poor job of taking into account the anticipated harms that are and volatility that climate change is already bringing. And it tends to put the focus, for example, to give an example of a process that I've been involved with here on the Central Coast, they're currently evaluating whether to increase the frequency of rocket launches from an Air Force base. And these rocket launches are putting a lot of satellites up into the outer space. And of course, that's all minerals and metals in those satellites and in the rockets to do things, deliver things like Starlink. And so boats and yachts in the middle of the ocean can have access to the internet, but also remote communities and things like that. So the EIA is trying to measure how seals and snowy plover, which is an endangered bird, how they hear these rocket launches, which are incredibly loud, right? They produce these big sonic booms and everything shakes. How they hear that in order to anticipate impacts, where I'm saying we need to flip the script and ask, will these species be able to reproduce in this area? If they can't reproduce here, where will they go to reproduce, given the pace and scale of development along the California Central Coast? how will their reproduction and so the viability of their lives change when, rocket launches increase from 6 a year to every 2 or 3 days, which is what they're contemplating. And so similar kind of exercise for salt flats and for brines, right? We need to understand that the lithium it will run out. It's not renewable. And so with that, all the other conditions that enable lithium to be in these ecosystems will also run out. They will also be exhausted. And so it will make it very difficult or impossible for species like flamingos and others to reproduce in these areas. And so that's, I think, the kind of shift that we need to begin to see, sort of asking very different questions about nature and about nature in our regulatory mechanisms. Yeah.
Professor, you argue that focusing on is there enough lithium distracts from a deeper question for how long can life itself be sustained at this rate of extraction? How have scientists, activists, and indigenous communities you have worked with tried to recenter that second question in public and policy discussions?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is worth celebrating is that just in the last 2 weeks, in Chile, the government has inaugurated 10 salt flats are now protected, have protected status. Of course, there are a lot of legitimate complaints, why 10 when there's, so many more that are open for business, for mining, and that are, will not have that status. But it has sort of helped to shift the script a little bit and help to consolidate this idea that salt flats are not mines, they are desert wetlands, they are ecosystems that sustain a very rich set of lives, animal lives, plant lives, human lives. I should have perhaps mentioned the Atacama Desert, despite being the driest desert in the world, is also an agricultural area. So indigenous communities, the Licanantay who live here, have practiced agriculture and pastoralism here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so that's really remarkable, right? These people know how to live with water scarcity, and in an increasingly water scarce world, that's something that we should all be learning from. So one of the key people here has been a microbiologist called Cristina Dorador. She is a professor at the university, at one of the universities in Antofagasta, which is the main city near the salt flat. And I think what she's done very well is push both the utilitarian arguments that these brines have, are teeming with microbial life, which might produce pharmaceuticals that might help advance human health and help to find cures to many of the ailments that are afflicting us. But at the same time, she hasn't stopped there. She has also pushed these other kinds of life-centering arguments that are based on love and respect for these ecosystems, for these territories, and for the networks of life that are there and that depend on them. She's also done a really great job of creating new scientific networks that bridge science, social science, humanities, art. So, she herself is a musician and a poet. And so she sort of symbolizes all of these things together, but I think it provides a really powerful example of how we might continue to advance protections and challenge this assumption that more mining is actually what we need and will deliver well-being. The other great protagonists here are indigenous communities. So the Licanantay, as I was mentioning earlier, they are particularly well organized in terms of their forms of government. So they have been very effective at redefining the benefits and the relationship between themselves and the companies. That said, it's not a perfect situation by any means because they are under a lot of pressure. They feel like they are stuck between a rock and a hard place. and that they're being forced to choose, bread today, hunger tomorrow. And so, I've heard this. I've been doing research with environmental movements and with fence-line communities in Chile for almost 2 decades now. And they all will say, no one walks away from, this much gold, this much lithium, this much copper. And so the sense that, these David and Goliath type fights, where the community is under a lot of pressure to simply get the best deal they can and allow the mine to come in.
Professor, before we wrap up, I would like to close with one last question. Looking ahead to the next decade, what science would tell you that the world is genuinely moving away from the extravagant logic you critique, from mining everywhere quickly, towards something like a slower, rights of nature informed approach to minerals and climate action?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. And I think I would encourage everyone to be asking themselves this and thinking about it. One of the first things that comes to mind is a public embrace of the idea of mining no-go zones. So areas that we collectively decide are just too important to be opened up for mining. We have examples of this globally. So for El Salvador, right, very small country with one single river watershed, for a number of years, had a national coalition saying no mining in the country because it would potentially contaminate and destroy the country's only source of fresh water. But places where agriculture is practiced, that have a high social, cultural, and ecological value. And here I would include the moon, right? There's plans, there's talk about mining on the moon. Imagine looking out at the moon and just seeing, craters from our mineral operations. It's an outlandish idea. And so embracing this idea that there are certain places that are just too important for mining to happen there. That might help us do some of the hard work needed to keep mines sort of as small and as slow as possible. Another thing I'm going to be looking for is taking seriously reduce and reuse, right? So we hear a lot about recycling. Recycling is a failure, to be very blunt and direct about it. Yes, there have been, small advances. Certainly things are better with recycling than without it, but recycling has failed to be a solution to any of our problems with consumption and waste management, because the economics of recycling are that it requires always fresh streams of raw material in order for there to continue to be a market for recycling. And so again, the market logic that's behind these systems makes it practically impossible for recycling to really be a solution to the problems that we're facing. So reduce and reuse. Right now, we're really far away from that. We see this very speculative boom in data centers construction. I'm sure that you're having these debates in communities all across India. There's a data center coming near you, wherever you happen to be. There you can be sure that there is one coming to a neighborhood near you. And these are very speculative investments that reflect, I think, again, an exhaustion of ideas, a real lack of imagination about what to do with the amount of money that the people who have money to invest have. And I think also then taking more seriously climate justice action. So at the end of the day, what all of these things point to is how do we take climate justice really seriously and center that in our policies? And by this, I mean, if we're constantly looking at new consumer technologies, and if we're constantly thinking that science and technology are going to solve the climate crisis, that always will mean, a consumer-based solution at the end of the day, which will always mean leaving out those with less consumer power, right? So that is the working classes in the United States, in India, in Chile, everywhere around the world. It means sacrificing certain people's territories. So those who happen to be living near the places where we want, with the resources that are needed in order for those with consumer power to be able to continue consuming as they have. A final thing that is just shocking to me how little attention this gets is the decommissioning of oil, gas, and coal. I mean, we're taking massive strides backwards in this country, in the United States, on this topic. You'll have seen yesterday's news with Trump, doubling down on a coal economy in different ways. But we need to do a lot more to decommission oil, gas, and coal. And I'll emphasize that, there's a lot of jobs to be had in that. And those are jobs, that's blue collar work, professional, skilled work that is going to be needed for many, many decades because the scale of the fossil fuel industrial infrastructure that exists is absolutely enormous. And we know here in the Central Coast, where we have been doing oil drilling for, again, a century and a half, we know that oil wells are never fully plugged. They have to be constantly plugged and replugged. And I've also done, some historical research on that. And so in many senses, that decommissioning work never finishes. And so taking decommissioning seriously, I think, is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you, Professor Barandiarán, for this rich and deeply thought-provoking conversation. Your work has not only illuminated the complex histories and politics behind lithium, but has also challenged us to rethink how we understand minerals as part of living ecosystems rather than mere commodities. I'm sure our listeners will carry these insights into how they think about climate solutions, development, and responsibility in the 21st century. We are grateful for your time and sharing your research and experience with us, and we look forward to following the continuing impact of living minerals and your future of work. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.